All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the opening session of this year's Debating Development series. This year is the 18th edition already, and for the second time now we are organizing the debates online for very obvious reasons. Last year it worked out quite well, and we were able to welcome speakers and participants from all over the world, which made the perspectives much more rich. And I'm really glad to see so many people have shown interest in this event. We have received more than 300 registrations, and just to give you an idea, currently there's about 140 participants that are listening together with you to this session. So, and people are still joining every minute. So a warm welcome to all of you. I'm Geert van Hekke. I'm Associate Professor at the Institute of Development Policy, or the IOB, here at the University of Antwerp. I'm also the academic coordinator of this Debating Development series, and together with Vijay Kolinjivari, we will be the hosts or moderators for tonight's exciting event. Vijay is a postdoctoral researcher here at the IOB and has also been involved in previous years' debating development series, both as a speaker and in organizing. But before we present our keynote speaker, Michel Bastian, to all of you, I'd like to take about 5 to 10 minutes of your time and give you some more context about this series and about the overarching topic that we have chosen for this year's event. And then also very briefly discuss some practicalities to guide you through this event. So Debating Development is a yearly event or series of events organized at our university as a partnership between the Institute of Development Policy, IOB, and the University Foundation for Development Cooperation, USOS, with generous financial support from the VLIR UOS Global Minds program. We have a fantastic team of people who have helped us organizing these debates, so already a big thanks to all of them. The series is both a what we call basket course or interfaculty-wide course for students at our university. This year we have about 160 enrolled students for this course. And at the same time, it's a public event that is open to a broader audience. Our main objective is to provide a public platform for reflection on issues related to so-called international development issues and processes. And so each year we identify and focus on one overarching relevant theme, and then kind of provide different perspectives by inviting speakers from international institutes, from social movements, and from academia to have a conversation about particular topics within the selected overarching theme. Maybe it's important also to stress that the idea of debating development should be mostly understood as conversations about development issues between those who are passionate about the subject. Some of our sessions are being conceptualized as debates, meaning that we invite people with quite or very different views. But especially in these times of virtual encounters, we also encourage conversations about particular topics in which overlapping perspectives and thus not necessarily opposed views are being discussed, but always with the intention of offering insights to a broad audience. By opening up this space, we want to avoid that our series are merely spaces of intellectual reflection, and instead aim to illustrate why and how the discussed issues matter, and to invite everyone to share their reflections on the conversation. At the same time, such a reflection cannot take place without also recognizing the history of the space from which we are having these conversations and what responsibilities such an acknowledgement implies. The IOB, one of the key organizers of this series, was historically established partly out of the campus of the former University Institute of Overseas Territories, better known as the Coloniale Hogeschool in Dutch, or Colonial University, created in 1920 to train colonial administrators of so-called Belgian Africa, and is therefore directly implicated in the history of uneven development and violent colonial legacies seen today in present-day DRC, Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. And all of this brings me to the overarching topic of this year's debating series, in which we focus on alternative conceptions of time and temporalities and how they are related or interrogate current dominant paradigms of progress and development. Mainstream development policies and programs largely built on assumptions about linear time frameworks, for example, using public clocks and calendars to think in only one direction about how the past is connected to the present and the future. And by doing so, risk foreclosing alternative ideas and imaginaries about what relationships we choose to focus on at the expense of others. For example, when we decide to plant 1 trillion trees as an urgent quick fix remedy to combat climate change, we think of only one relationship of time, which is the time it takes to sequester the carbon, but not about the time stolen from the millions of people who have and continue to cultivate intimate relationships and specialized knowledge with the land over generations, or the time of symbiotic relationships between fungi and tree roots that aid in stabilizing the soil and generating the conditions for life. By prioritizing a linear cause and effect relationship in fixing problems, the future is assumed to always be getting better. Yet this logic fails to recognize and act upon the historical evidence of development practice that has and continues to generate ecological breakdown in the first place. So what does an understanding of time and temporality suggest for how we think about the possibilities for change under the banner of development and the kinds of narratives and grounded practices that will be advanced as a result? The pandemic, for example, has allowed us to think time differently, even though many of us may have already gotten used to the productivity discipline or the new normal once again, or never even had a choice in the matter to begin with. In reaction to perceptions of an ever-accelerating society hurling towards modern progress and techno-optimism, and amidst the contradictions of inequality and ecological breakdown, there have been increasing attempts to slow down. These have emerged as a range of slowness movements in attempts to take back control over the time of both people's labor and their life worlds, and to offer other forms of strategies to coordinate plural relationships between humans and non-humans. At the same time, the idea of slowness has also received a lot of criticisms from different perspectives. And so in this series, we want to unpack, together with our speakers and with all of you, some of the main insights on time and temporality as they relate to the notion of development, and to seek out together how these discussions and some of the demands of specific movements are relevant to contemporary debates, including the importance of time in struggles for food sovereignty, the role of knowledge production or so-called slow science in relation to academia, the temporalities of decolonial struggles, and the ways in which temporality plays a role in quality healthcare. In our final live panel on Tuesday, the 23rd of November, we discussed the political action of transnational social movements historically, providing the context for discussion of the possibilities and prospects for movements that use alternative ways of looking at time and temporalities.
Thanks, Gert. Just to follow up, this brings us now to tonight's conversation, which will kind of set the scene for all of the other sessions that we have planned over the course of the next 2 months, and that you can also see on the website. So for tonight's opening debate, we've invited Dr. Michel Bastian to discuss the role of modern linear conceptions of time as ticking clock, in sustaining the imaginary of a chronologically improving development model rooted in capitalist modernity and colonial violence. In this session, we will explore the promises and pitfalls of understanding time and temporality differently, and especially in conversation with what this means from a slowness or slow movement perspective and its relation to alternative conceptions of development. So a little bit about our speaker. Michelle Bastian works in the areas of critical time studies and environmental humanities, with a particular focus on the relationship between time and belonging. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and was a research associate at the Centre for Research on Sociocultural Change at the University of Manchester before taking up her current role at the University of Edinburgh. Michelle's work has focused on time and community, local food projects, sustainable economies, temporal design and transition towns. Her work has also been published in a range of journals, including environmental humanities, geohumanities, and new formations. And she's also the editor-in-chief for the journal Time and Society. So a warm welcome to Michelle. So just a note on how this will work. First, we'll give the floor to Michelle, who will give a keynote of about 30 to 40 minutes. And when there's 5 minutes left, we'll give a sign, so probably through the chat on the platform. After that, both Gert and I will facilitate a conversation with Michelle on some of the topics that were raised and also the broader implications. And during this facilitation, we will also integrate some of the questions that our students have submitted on the basis of a text that was suggested by Michelle, which is Kyle White's piece Time as Kinship. And I think this text has also been shared with the broader audience as well. And on the basis of that text and the conversation, we will raise some of these questions. And so for the broader audience, so for all of you, you will also have a chance to ask some questions, which we will raise at a later stage, and this will be done through Q&A window, which is part of Zoom. So later you can post those questions, and we can also ask everybody else to vote as well for the questions that they want to be asked. And that way we can hope to have sort of a democratically chosen set of relevant questions, which we can then discuss together. And so we know it's not ideal, but we've been doing this now for a year plus. So I think this is maybe the best way to go through the questions. So without further ado, now I give the floor to Michelle.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for coming. I mean, first I would say thank you to Gert and Vijay for inviting me. It's really exciting to have this chance to talk to all of you about this work, which is quite new for me, something I've only just started thinking about. So it's really nice to see, you know, what responses it brings out in you. And so I'm really looking forward to any questions or comments that after our conversation that everybody else brings into the discussion as well. And particularly, I know that we all have so many competing responsibilities and demands on our time, and particularly this slot I know is you know, getting home time, cooking dinner time, getting the kids to bed time. So thanks for many people. So thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. You might have heard, well, I did my PhD in Australia, but you might be able to hear from my accent, I'm Australian. And so I did want to start with an acknowledgement of country, even if I'm not in Australia at the moment. Just feel it's really important to begin our talk with that. So I'm just going to start with that, and then before I get into the talk proper. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I was raised and educated on the lands of the Ngunnawal people in what is now called Canberra, Australia. And that my family has and continues to occupy land in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and the Australian Capital Territory. I pay my respects to the elders of these places, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. So prompted by a white paper on online events from Anne Pasek, who herself was inspired by theatre artist Claudia Alec, I also want to consider the lands connected to the Zoom infrastructure that we're using here tonight, thinking about how to place this seeming ephemeral infrastructure that we're all using right now. The Zoom headquarters are located in what is now called San Jose, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamian peoples. And data produced through Zoom calls are stored and routed in Equinix data centers, which you can also look up for yourself to find out where they might be located. The closest one for me is in Manchester in the UK. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Ohlone and Tamian peoples on whose land the infrastructure for our meeting today is in part supported, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I've only begun to educate myself about my responsibilities within these contexts, and I certainly need to do more to put these acknowledgements into practice rather than just spouting it at the beginning of my talk. So I think it's also important for me to say there's a lot of work we need to do to earn the privilege of being able to make those acknowledgements. So I hope that my reflections here, which rework some of my previous thinking on time and sustainability, form one part of work that I very much need to do, as many of us do. So while by the end of the paper we'll get, oh, I haven't shared my slides, I realized. Let me do that.
Yeah, I think we can see the slides now.
Okay, great. And I'm also just going to show the video panel so for myself, so I've got someone to talk to as well. I might put these. Okay, so we'll start with the snail as a nice way of thinking about slow. So while by the end of this paper, we'll get to the question in my title, Slow as a Trap or as a Promise, I'll get there by also considering another temporal framework that I imagine you'll see a lot in development discourse, namely short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. So covering these both together will help to show the worry that first prompted me to write this paper, which was that the way that we talk about bad times and the good times that we want to replace them with risk falling into a kind of greenwashing or chrono-washing mentality, where we act as if we are concerned with time, but without really looking at the deeper structural changes needed to really get there. So I'm going to suggest three other temporal concepts that we might want to focus on alongside of, or even instead of, slow or long-term thinking. These are racism as time machine, temporal narcissism, and riffing off Donna Haraway's work, condensed clocks of contestable worlds. And I'll unpack each of those as we go along, just to kind of bring them up at the front for everybody. Okay, so in Kim Stanley Robinson's recent sci-fi novel, Ministry for the Future, which is a nice place to sort of start thinking about our imaginaries of time, a sweeping vision is offered of how the climate crisis will be addressed in this century. Perhaps surprisingly, the novel suggests that the key actors able to change the fate of humanity are bankers. Once the main figure from the UN Ministry for the Future is able to convince them to back a new cryptocurrency tied to sequestering carbon, the new path into the future is forged. Key to the currency's success is central bank support for tying it to 100-year bonds. With more confidence in the long-term future, corporations, countries, communities, and individuals start the great drawdown, carbon drawdown. So these carbon coins not only address, I don't think we'll get to that yet. These coins not only address the practical problems of carbon emissions, they are also an answer to what Robinson describes as the tragedy of the time horizon. Replacing the now defunct tragedy of the commons, we are instead caught in a cycle, according to Robinson, caught in a cycle of short-term thinking, which is destroying the basis of earthly life. The tragedy is that we, in inverted commas, can't see the impacts of what we are doing until much later down the line, and thus we cannot motivate ourselves enough to stop this behavior. Long-term thinking is thus proposed as an essential part of the solution. Reaching far beyond this particular novel, this set of claims about time has now become environmental common sense. And I imagine common sense within a lot of development discourses as well. So in looking at these narratives of sustaining time, that is the stories about what kind of time will support better futures, so the sustainable futures, or more livable futures, more equitable futures. I've suggested in a previous paper that I've written for Geohumanities that there are at least 5 temporal counter-narratives which have been widely taken up. Alongside long-term thinking, we also have critiques of growth over time. So here you can think about steady state or degrowth proposals. We have the slow movement, obviously the particular focus of this series, in which I'll be talking about in a bit more below. Fostering cyclical temporalities, so the work on the circular economy, for example, and rebalancing working hours. And here we might think about movements for a 4-day week or basic citizens' income. However, during a research project where I visited a wide variety of grassroots businesses aiming towards sustainability, we found that none of these were actually used as key guideposts for their activities. And none of these kinds of sustaining times were ones that actually were used as the kind of fabric for what they built their business from. And I think this supports sociologist of time, Barbara Adams' critique of the tendency to think about time in binaries, and particularly to think of solutions to time problems in binaries. So fast, slow, progress, regress, short, long. For the businesses I visited, what was going on instead were complex efforts to restory time in context-specific ways, which address the particular conflicts at work in their efforts to build their businesses differently. And it's in this gap, I think, between the ideal conceptions of a sustaining or unsustaining time, so fast time, slow time. So the gap between that and the work needed to create specific temporal infrastructures that might actually enact the kind of values that we're aiming for. It's in this gap that this notion of chrono washing appears. So this is a concept. Check. This is a concept that I've only recently started thinking about, thanks to a prompt from Tim Middleton, who invited me to a seminar to speak about philosophy of deep time. And I'm looking forward to developing it even further with you tonight. So it comes from a worry that, like greenwashing, there are ways of using temporal concepts to perform concern with sustainability in a way that at best maintains the status quo and at worst covers over increasing destruction and inequality. And you can, if you read some of the slow critiques of the slow movements, you can see examples of that already working within there. So I'm going to suggest that this can occur when we pay insufficient attention to what time is, how it operates in and is operated by societies, its complex role in not just counting and measuring, but in strategies of legitimation, of social inclusion and exclusion, time as coordination, time as organization. This is when we reduce our conceptions of sustainable times, or more equitable times, better times, for world economies, whatever kind of framework you're thinking about. We reduce these conceptions to ones that focus on chronological elements like pace, how far forward or back we count, numbers of work hours, and similar. We miss what is really crucial about restoring time for sustainability. Because linear time has been naturalized for so long in Western societies, talking about time in this way can seem really straightforward, even matter of fact. So talking about time as pace, as fast or slow. But it covers over the way that time is, first of all, a mode of managing relationality, about managing our relationships with the world around us and with others. And I'm taking this from anthropologist Carol Greenhouse's work. Time is a way of understanding how we are with all those people, creatures and elements that make up our world, and helps to explain, to justify, or to pave over those that we have excluded. All forms of time select some rhythms, processes, and changes that will be kept in view and coordinated with, and obscures others. So let's take Robertson's notion of the tragedy of the time horizon as an example. It's based on, and I'll just return back to the slide actually where he talks about it. So it's based on a classical economic view of mankind as self-interested and rational. It also creates a shifting baseline of a present we who can't see the impacts of their actions, and future generations always being ahead. The damage is perpetually ahead too, not, I would argue, because of an inherent nature of polluting chemicals, radiation, carbon, which we hear a lot about how it's hard to know just how big the effects of those are going to be because they accumulate slowly. I don't think that's what the problem is. The problem is because the damage that is happening right now, and indeed has happened decades ago and centuries ago, just doesn't matter to this we. So this we that keeps thinking that the problem is going to be somewhere ahead of us. And a nice example of this is the principles of environmental justice, which were agreed by the delegates to the first National People of Colour Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991, for example. They include the following, and this is the fourth point on their list. Environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic and hazardous wastes and poisons, and nuclear testing that threaten the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. So 3 decades prior to Robinson's book, some people had already been hit by the damage and had already demanded that it be costed in. This is, of course, only one example among countless others where consequences of current and past actions have been noticed and yet haven't been acted on. Describing what's going on here as an issue of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking is chrono washing in action. I would suggest that calling these kinds of pollution slow violence is chrono washing as well, since both center time as chronological flow and obscures time as the management of diversity and relationality. From a view of time as relational, the problem might instead be that racism is a time machine that spirits problems away into a disembodied future. So the problem of nuclear waste keeps getting put ahead, even though many people are already affected and have been for a very long time affected by nuclear radiation fallout, storage problems, leakages, all this kind of thing. It's not something that's only happening in some imaginary future. And you can see, I mean, something else that was in the news when I was just thinking about this is the residential school murders in Canada, where racism and time machine works to put something in the past, that what happened there was something that was in the past. So it puts it out of the present as something that's not relevant to today. So this kind of movement of moving something moving a problem into the future or into the past lets dominant groups, particularly white Western peoples, feel as if the real damage is still to come, or is something that's already done and there's nothing you can do about it. You can only say that the short term is free from damage, as Robinson has here in this quote, if you are insulated from what is already happening. Here we might want to ask whether white people find the prompts of long-term thinking necessary for confronting the consequences of carbon, coal, concrete, plastics pollution, because the lives that are being most affected by these things in the present, disproportionately those of brown, black, and indigenous peoples, are not sufficient motivation for action. Will we only be motivated by longer term, which most clearly shows the destruction of ways of life that we benefit from? So for Barbara Adam, accounting for social transformations in terms of dualistic shifts from one time regime from another, fast to slow, for example, misses the mark because temporal innovations are not successes that replace what went before or additions that leave everything else intact. Instead, she has emphasized the need to explore how different temporal processes or times are entangled with each other through what she describes as hierarchical nesting and implication with enfoldment and resonance. Unpacking another example with this in mind, I want to supplement racism as time machine with a notion of temporal narcissism, which I take from the work of James Hatley and Deborah Berg-Rose. I'll do this by reading The Clock of the Long Now, a project often name-checked in discussions of long-term thinking. I want to read the clock not in isolation, but as nested and implicated within wider temporal infrastructures. So for those of you who have not come across this project, the clock is described as a tool for encouraging long-term responsibility. And I think this is really helpful to think about in terms of the slow movement as well, because of the emphasis that's often placed there in this slow allows a sense of the longer term and allowed us a sense of wider responsibility for what's happening. So as Stuart Brand, a member of the Long Now Foundation, explains, the quote, ambition and folly of the clock is to reframe human endeavour and to do so not with a thesis, but with a theme. The main problems that the clock seeks to respond to are how do we make long-term thinking automatic and common instead of difficult and rare? How do we make the taking of long-term responsibility inevitable? First proposed by scientist and inventor Danny Hillis, the clock of the long now does not mark seconds and minutes. Rather, it ticks once a year, the century hand advances once every 100 years, and the cuckoo comes out on the millennium. In the planning stages, a number of proposals and sites were explored, with building now underway inside an excavated space within a mountain in Texas owned by Amazon founder and principal funder of the clock, Jeff Bezos. As already hinted at, the Clock of the Long Now is a massive building project requiring significant excavation work. Sorry, I thought I had a nice picture of them digging out the mountain, but you'll have to have a look on the website. So it involves the building of a 200-foot high clock. Many technologies are being invented specifically for the project, and it's also located in a remote area that is generally only accessible to keen hikers. In terms of its technical achievements, then, the project is impressive and widely generates curiosity, amazement, and awe. As Kevin Kelly, a Long Now Foundation board member, writes, there's a huge geek out factor in the clock because the engineering challenges are formidable. What do you build that won't corrode in 100 centuries? How do you keep it accurate when no one is around? The clock's technical solutions are often ingenious. As a result, the project is extremely expensive, and while earlier trials and iterations received a variety of funding, the current clock is being built on Bezos's property and was funded by him with an initial budget of $42 million US. Asked how he justifies spending such a large amount of money on a seemingly impractical project, Bezos told Wise, Dylan Tweeney, that long-term thinking is just intrinsically worthwhile, and further that no other billionaire is building a clock like this, for the sole purpose of changing humanity's relationship to time. So what's going on with this effort to change humanity's relationship to time? Again, just to tie it again to the slow movement, something the slow movement is very interested in, to how to change our relationship to time. And this thesis, this thing rather than a thesis. But how do we understand that in an enfolded way rather than just the kind of surface conception of temporality that it seems to be proposing? So in much of the commentary on Bezos and the Clock of the Long Now, the collaboration is often seen as a match made in heaven. Bezos has become well known throughout the tech industry for being a long-term thinker. As his first letter to Amazon.com shareholders in 1997 sets out, his interest is in pursuing, quote, long-term market leadership considerations rather than short-term profitability considerations. As Bezos states, one of the 3 basic rules of Amazon is, quote, patience. We are looking at the long term. We know how to wait for results, which again might seem like a slow, something from a slow manifesto as well. His early investment in ebook readers is cited as a clear example of this priority of the long term over the short term. And so has his interest in space travel. However, as I'm sure all of us will be familiar with, Bezos is also responsible for the creation of a massive infrastructure that arguably utilizes short-term thinking and very fast processes and encourages short-term thinking in its users. So while the clock of the long now seeks to make long-term thinking automatic, the aim of Amazon is arguably to encourage expectations of speed and immediacy. New innovations like one-click ordering, Amazon Prime, the Kindle, market themselves on their swiftness and ease of use. You don't need to think about all the externals because Amazon will sort those out for you. Moreover, when we shift our lens from Amazon customers to its employees, we are also led to consider the high-pressure experiences of order pickers and others working at the company's fulfillment centers who must work at a very fast pace on short-term flexible contracts. Given its extensive customer, worker, and supplier bases, a serious commitment to changing humanity's relationship to time, as Bezos claims, is undermined when the global influence that a company like Amazon has in its entanglement with people's lives is not also attended to. The core question is then, can the clock of the long now compete with the clock of Amazon when it becomes embedded within certain sensibilities around time? What meaning does the long term have for fulfillment center workers with no security of contract, for example? What the clock of Amazon supports then is actually the possibility of ignoring the long term for some people, while encouraging its users to act on fleeting impulses rather than making more deliberate decisions. The risk for the Long Now Foundation in aligning its understanding of the long term with Bezos is that much of this purported radical nature is lost, and the clock of the long now appears to have very little chance of competing with the more widespread material cultures of time that companies like Amazon are actively encouraging. So instead, the long now becomes enfolded within a larger temporal narcissism, whereas Jim Hatley writes, all the other times are resources for one's own. Think, for instance, of the already infamous comment Bezos made after returning from his recent space flight. And I'll just read this out. I also want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer because you guys paid for all this. Seriously, for every Amazon customer out there and every Amazon employee, thank you from the bottom of my heart very much. Here we see a massive funneling of time, not just work hours, but life hours, the effort to make an Amazon job work somehow, the massive subsidies provided to lure the fulfillment centers to areas that need jobs. As Bruno Latour writes, one can be allowed to forget for a moment that smooth displacement in time and space is paid for by someone else, by other people, but not forever. Despite all this, the unfolding of the clock set up to teach us how to take responsibility. That clock, enfolding it within the clock of Amazon, has not met much protest, and the association between the clock, Bezos, and long-term remains as solid as ever. And you'll see the clock of the long now used in examples all over the place in environmental debates and sustainability debates as an example of this shift in time that we need to make to move to a more ethical time. Compare this, however, to a recent statement from the philanthropist Mackenzie Scott. After donating over $2.7 billion US a couple of months ago. It's a pointed critique of her ex-husband's approach to social change and even long-term thinking, which has concentrated unthinkable wealth in a small number of people's hands. Here she criticizes these vast infrastructures, and in a more useful account of what the long-term and what a slow society, if you want to think about it like that, might really mean. She emphasizes the need to support relationships within communities in the present. Shouldn't her call to stop having to work every weekend to get some sleep, which she sees the funding as enabling, shouldn't this actually be our catch cry for a more sustainable future, which is built on inclusivity and strengthened community agency and responsibility? A reorientation to time that sees that what is important is the quality and diversity of the relationships being built, rather than a flattening out into a clock that ticks a bit longer and is slightly different from usual. Okay, so what about slow though? So let's focus more carefully on the theme that we're running through this series of these seminars. Slow as a way into considered, generous, and more attentive relationships is another temporal counter-narrative that has become a common sense solution. And I think you can see that by the way the slow has proliferated so widely that it's been taken up as some, sort of movable descriptor that can be placed on anything where there's a problem of some kind. But like long-term thinking, I want to suggest that it too can become an unhelpful chrono-washing when applied as a matter of course. That is, while we might feel comfortable with slow as a kind of call to arms, perhaps a more gentle version of branding or identity, common identity, which brings people together around common interests. Perhaps thinking about slow in that way, might not be so problematic. But I want to suggest that if we view slow as a temporal tool, as the temporal tool that we need to bring these aspirations about, then we are washing over the complexities a truly sustaining time requires. So to show what I mean here, I thought it would be really helpful to go back to Carlo Petrini's Slow Food, The Case for Taste from 2001, and compare this to the Slow Science Manifesto from 2010. So Petrini is perhaps best known for his protests against the opening of a McDonald's in Rome in 1986. And the contrast between the fast food empire and slow food dedicated to supporting local food cultures provides an easy hook for the many magazine and newspaper articles that have been written about the movement. What I find surprising when I first delved into this book, however, is that he tells a very different story of its origins. Instead of the dialectic struggle between fast and slow, Petrini opens with the story of a tanning village where he comes from and its strong heritage of workers' cooperatives and associations. It is within this history of collaborative action that the movement to support, and this is a quote, the importance of the right to good, clean and fair food for everyone is placed. So it's first placed within collectives, cooperatives, unions. That's where we find it, rather than this battle between the fast and the slow. Throughout the book, we do not learn about taking things slowly so much as the coalitions created between cooks, politicians, farmers, artisans, and others as they challenge food policies, lobby for changes to funding schemes, publicize local cuisines, and encourage knowledge of local breeds and plant varieties. In other words, the time of slow food is not about pace, but about the kinds of coordination needed to rebuild connections, infrastructures, and shared bodily experiences. This often gets washed out by the charisma of slow itself. So let's compare this to the aspirations described in the Slow Science Manifesto. First, let me say that I'm not criticizing the aspirations in this manifesto per se. There's much about them that's really appealing. I think it's just interesting to see what happens to slow when it gets taken out of the particular context of the slow food movement and taken as a, this is the temporal answer to our problem and applied somewhere else. If you've had a chance to sort of scan through it, you'll see that there's very little in it that actually resembles the slow food movement as I've briefly sketched it. The heritage is drawn on and their meanings are different, so they're not going back to collective efforts, for example. Well, collective efforts to build science, but not in a different kind of way, I suppose. The desire is for an ability to withdraw from particular responsibilities for a time. And the Slow Science Academy that is proposed is for, quote, groups of basic researchers alongside select brains from science affinity areas, and for those select group of people to discuss, wonder, and think. So we see a very different set of aims arising from a very different set of contexts for a very select set of people. Why should slow be the key word here for unlocking a different set of relations? Has the use of slow with its sense of a beneficial sustaining time led to less interest than there might be in what actions should be taken and which levers pulled in order to create a more fair and thoughtful university? So if you didn't sort of just blanket apply this idea of slow to this better university, is there another kind of temporal issue that you might draw on to pull attention? Is there you know, the kind of time that might need to unionize the university so you could support these kinds of roles more easily for more people across the university? Might that be considered, I suppose, rather than the kind of things that slow prompts you to think about when you think about it just as pace? So my questions here are not so different to what others have asked about the dangers of slow and how it might lead us to overlooking inequalities and injustices. What I want to add to these discussions, though, is the proposal that slow food would be better understood not as a model to be taken and applied widely, but as context-specific figuration in Donna Haraway's terms, which works into and re-stories a particular set of relations using languages and motifs that are immanent within those relations. So that slow food, you know, works because of a particular context, but when it's taken from that, it gets quite flattened out and loses its power, actually. And it's that assumption that it can be just moved around willy-nilly that seems quite problematic. So at one point, Donna Haraway argues that figurations, if you know her work, the cyborg or the modest witness or the companion species, are all these kinds of figurations. She describes these as condensed maps of contestable worlds. Further, in her book, Modest Witness, she argues that figures always bring with them some temporal modality that organizes interpretive practice, gives you a frame for organizing the temporality of that field of intervention. So given this, it seems entirely plausible that figurations do more than remap worlds. They would also appear to be capable of drawing together worlds that have become desynchronized or detemporalized from each other and retime them. In recalibrating particular contexts through temporal counter-narratives, we might very well be looking for figures that can act as condensed clocks of contestable worlds, so specific condensed clocks rather than just applying slow to all these different contexts. I suggest this because, to go back to our discussion of grassroots sustainable economies, it was these kinds of specific struggles over time that were crucial to their work. The question wasn't about slow or fast or short-term or long-term, but about how to entice people into spending an hour at a stove in order to make their own cheese, for example, for a local food organization, or how to arrange a notification system on a tool sharing app so that it would be responsive but not too annoying. You know, that was the people who were interested in sharing economies. That was the kind of time they were worried about. So in other words, these businesses worried not about how to change pace or horizons, but how to coordinate relationships among people, the things, and non-humans differently. Applying slow indiscriminately acts as if retiming has been considered, when actually a more specific language context or pulling at the threads might be needed. What would really pull at the threads in those contexts? So just to conclude, racism as time machine, temporal narcissism, condensed clocks of contestable worlds, these are just some of the kinds of temporal reworking we might do when we step back from a conception of time as chronological and towards time as relational and coordinating. So I'm not saying that talking about long-term slow or similar temporal concepts is absolutely necessarily problematic, but that we always need to be attentive to what aspects of the world these concepts are drawing attention to, in which they are rendering invisible or illegitimate. The clock of the long now, you know, drew attention to long-term and responsibility, and in doing sort of wiped out all the irresponsibility and short-term thinking that goes into funding it, to allowing it to be. So perhaps rather than retaining a conception of time as flow, we can instead work from theories that more clearly foreground time as relational. So a paper I've come across recently that does this brilliantly, which hopefully many of you had the chance to engage with, was the reading that I suggested. So Kyle Powers-White's, a Potawatomi scholar, called Kinship Time. So White has already made significant interventions into the white Western concept of the apocalypse as ahead rather than having already happened. And really great papers around that. But in Kinship Time, the issues he raises encourage us to ask, do the current candidates for sustainable time help to focus those most privileged on the responsibilities they have in the present? Do they encourage us to look at the shadow places that the clock of Amazon and all of its ilk use to support current ways of doing and being? Some will say yes, but only when used carefully, and in so much as longer times intersect with what we are doing right here, right now. But as White points out, kinship time, a quote from him, kinship time as opposed to linear time reveals how today's climate change risks are already caused by people's not taking responsibility for one another's safety, well-being, and self-determination. Any solutions to climate change will be enacted within a state of affairs that are already rife with irresponsibility. It's not ahead, it's already happening. It has been happening for a long time. Thus, White challenges the linear time of quantification and calculability, and instead draws on work from other Indigenous scholars who tell the time of climate change in terms of shifts in kinship relationships. Opposing the IPCC urging to act within the next 10 years as an abstract quantitative claim, White reminds us that from the perspective of kinship time, change happens in terms of how well constructed relationships of interdependence are. Here it is trust, justice, and responsibility that moves the temporalities of change, not the counting of moments or stretching out of flows. There is much more to be learned from White and others' work, but I want to end here and suggest that arguing that slow is a good response to fast is a trap. We need to diagnose both the problem and the solution differently. That is, the problem is temporal processes that destroy kinship responsibility sovereignty. Describing this through the shorthand of speed disappears all those layers of what is actually being done by those with privilege. Likewise, the solution is coalition, solidarity, kinship, and the temporalities that would support those. The specific everyday work of dismantling privilege in an everyday shot through with longer and slower processes, yes, but an everyday that looks to who or what is being managed out of the time frame, just as much as what it's been expanded to include. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.